We've heard so much about Tartarian architecture, old world buildings, the usage of brick and stone, and the beauty of the old world. I decided to go through all of my old photographs and movies of some of these old world buildings from Chicago and the suburbs around it in Illinois. Yes, certainly some of the old world buildings, particularly churches or government buildings, were built out of very expensive material and have lasted for hundreds of years. Most of the frontier towns, which would be the suburbs, did not have as exquisite of buildings as Chicago has had, but they do have some strange anomalies because a lot of their buildings were moved. Now, you can see when you go on the train into Chicago, the various time periods. You'll have your modern day buildings and houses and the train station, and then you'll see old houses and very old buildings. Most of those old buildings were factories that people were working in most of their life and dying young. So we do have a history in the old buildings, and many of them have been repurposed. We have torn several of them down and built over them. But what we must remember is that what you see is only the recent history. Because all of Chicago and Chicagoland had a population that lived there. Not only did it have a population that lived there during the 1800s and 1700s, but for thousands of years. And what has been accepted as a Native American tribe that had lived in the Chicago and Chicagoland area by the United States government today is not necessarily the descendants of the people that lived in this area. There are many recorded wars between who was in this area prior to the current or latest European migration in the 1800s to the area. In fact, my research indicates that people of great stature were in Chicago and the Chicagoland area, and they were mound builders. This information is hidden. Chicago and the Chicagoland area has never acknowledged the mound builders, which is something that I will be working on down the road. But as I'm doing my research, I have found many stories of wars that went on between whoever was here in Chicago and Chicagoland and that built those mounds and the currently accepted historical Native American tribes. In fact, there are recordings of giants that were found in graves and mounds of the Chicagoland area, and these skeleton remains were taken by local museums and educational institutions, never to be examined ever again. So as we look at what we see for maybe 200 or 300 years of history in these old buildings, we must remember that something was here before and that they were essentially killed off. How far back do the remains go that were found in Illinois? The fact is that there are those that are almost 12,000 years old found in the Barrington, Illinois area that were taken by the state of Illinois in the 1990s after a court confrontation between land developers and those that didn't want the land developed in which the bodies were found. There has never been a proper DNA analysis or testing or determination of who they were. Only just a brief acknowledgement that Native Americans were in Chicago and the Chicagoland area. I will not go into any further detail because this is a subject that I will be researching and exposing down the road. But as I have shown in previous videos and research, there were maps that marked America not only as Tartaria, but Atlantis. Strangely, there are many petroglyphs that were found in Illinois, including the PA suburb closer to southern Illinois, that represents some sort of a predatory bird that would eat humans and would be eventually killed by the Native Americans. Could this bird have been really a griffin, which could have been a leftover pterosaur? We don't really know. But here we are, looking at modern Chicago and the suburbs and thinking that the last 200 years were the peak of our development of this land. Well, below our feet, we have no idea who was here 12,000 years ago and who these giants were that were allegedly pulled out of the mounds that nobody will admit exist and existed in Chicago and the Chicagoland area. So while we think that Tartaria was deliberately erased, which it was, we must also understand that Atlantis was also deliberately erased. So here are some pictures and videos of the suburbs, and you can see that many of the settler buildings were just simplistic, made of wood or stone, whatever they could get. And many of the towns have tried to preserve at least one of these buildings. But also, they have built some new buildings in that style, but most buildings they have not. So if you look around wherever you are, you'll see that it's a mix of various time zones. And even that many of these buildings were actually picked up and physically moved to a different area. And Highland Park is one example of that. So please enjoy the rest of the pictures and the videos of the old world and new world buildings. And remember that as above, so below may not simply apply to what is in the sky and on earth, but perhaps what is in the ground and on the earth. Thank you.